Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you in this very nice room of participants from around the world in today's session, which is the fourth session of the Corporate Strategy Masterclass, organized by the SMS Corporate Strategy Interest Group. The first masterclass was on the evolution of corporate strategy by Connie Halfat and David Teese. The second one was on diversification by Bob Hoskinson and Belen Villalonga. And earlier this year, we had our third session on organization design by Finish Pirina. In terms of future sessions, the next masterclass on mergers and acquisitions that was originally scheduled for May has now been moved to this fall due to Will Mitchell's passing. So instead of M&As, we've scheduled a new masterclass on the related corporate strategy topic, resource reallocation. More details on the speakers and the dates and all recorded videos of masterclasses will be available on the IG's website. Today, we are delighted to have two wonderful speakers, Brian Silverman and Todd Zenger, join us as experts on the theories of the firm. This session, like the other masterclasses, is so wonderfully organized by Katie Magelson from LBS. I just have a few very quick words to introduce our speakers. Professor Brian Silverman is a professor of strategic management and holds the J.R.S. Pritchard and N. Wilson Chair in Management at the Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto. His research focuses on the ways in which a firm's competitive strategy and organizational structure interact to affect its performance, in particular, its ability to access and exploit technological capabilities. Professor Todd Zenger is the Ann Eldon Tanner Chair in Strategy and Strategic Leadership at the David Eccles School of Business at the University of Utah. He also holds the University of Utah designation as a presidential professor. His current research focuses on the dynamics of organizational design, the role of capital markets in shaping corporate strategy, and the role of strategic leaders in finding and solving problems. Brian and Todd currently are also the editor of Strategic Management Journal and Strategy Science, respectively, which are the top journals where research on corporate strategy is often published. The SMS Corporate Strategy IG is delighted that Brian and Todd have kindly agreed to do a masterclass on theories of the firm with us today. Thank you, Brian, and thank you, Todd, for joining us today and for sharing your insights and thoughts on this extremely important topic and foundation for the field. In terms of process, Brian and Todd will each speak for about 20 minutes, starting with Todd and then continuing on to Brian. We'll use the remaining time for questions and answers. So for that, please post your questions in the chat function throughout the talk. And we'll be sure to come back to those questions in the last portion of our session today. So thank you both again. And without further ado, I'll pass this on to Todd. And Todd, the screen and the microphone is yours.
Great, thank you. Let's see. There we go. All right, what a wonderful, let me just say at the outset, what a wonderful innovation that corporate strategy has taken up, these master classes. And I'm very honored to be co-hosting this, or not hosting it, but co-presenting with Brian on this important topic. I'm going to try to be both sort of integrative and a bit provocative in my comments. I'm not going to spend a lot of time sort of articulating theories of the firm, but instead to provide some commentary and thoughts on where the state of this space. So let me just sort of state at the outset that I think there's an important distinction to make between just sort of broadly theories of organization and what one might think about as theories of the firm, and perhaps even more narrowly sort of theories of firm boundaries. And while theories of the firm may try to describe, how organization works more broadly, theories of the firm are particularly focused on the existence of firms, and in particular, kind of the boundary question. And different theories of the firm are a little bit less focused on boundaries than others, and I've tried to position them here. But we're going to particularly focus on theories of firm boundaries in this discussion. Second point I want to kind of broadly make is that the theory of the firm, I think, has typically been characterized as not particularly strategic, that it's had this feel of, you tell me the nature of the transaction or the activity and its characteristics, and we put it into the theory, and it tells us whether we should make it or buy it, rather whether it should be inside the firm or outside the firm. It's been kind of very reductionist in the way it's been thought about and treated, as opposed to kind of a more strategic theory of the firm, which might ask a question like, I have a strategy or a theory of value. How do I organize to pursue it? And I think the theory of the firm has a lot to say as a strategic theory of the firm, which is one of the early points I want to make here. So thinking about, kind of this question of using it in a strategic way, the question here is, okay, I've got some theory of value. I've defined a set of, activities that I think are essential to introducing this value, and I have some sense of how these activities need to be composed. Then the question becomes, how do I organize this task? And this is ideally what a strategic theory of the firm would provide. It's like, okay, these are the activities I think need to be inside the firm. That defines the boundary of the firm. And then there's sort of some secondary questions around, okay, those activities that we choose to have outside the firm, how do we establish varying contractual or other types of arrangements to access those particular activities? So the strategic theory is sort of thinking at a broad level. What's the theory? How do I think about this make-buy decision in order to compose this value that I envision? Let me make a comment a little bit about I think one of the streams of empirical literature that we're seeing in theory, kind of around theories of the firm, is sort of a competitive approach, right? Where we sort of say, okay, let's pit this theory of the firm against that theory of the firm in order to determine which one is more influential in explaining the boundary. And one of my challenges with this is it seems a little bit like, the analog here would be trying to explain the water level, the boundary here between water and non-water in a glass. And you could have theories about the shape of this glass and how it's going to affect that water line. You can have theories of precipitation. You can have theories of evaporation, and pitting those theories against one another in an empirical exercise is obviously problematic, because to understand this boundary, this water level, really requires a deep understanding of all of those theories. And my sense of the theories of the firm is that it's really of this kind of character, that if you want to think about theories of the firm, we have theories of the firm that are trying to explain pressures that expand the boundary into the firm, and theories that are trying to explain when we're going to more likely to see markets. And we have theories, therefore, about when markets fail. This would be TCE, and property rights theories are particularly focused on this kind of thing. Other theories that might be explaining organizational failure, other theories that are trying to articulate the virtues of markets. Think of Hayek and other just sort of people talking about how markets work. And then you've got other theories, knowledge-based theories, property rights here as well, that are discussing kind of the virtues of organizations. And to really understand where this water line sits, or where the boundary of the firm sits, you really have to understand all of these forces. You have to understand politics inside firms and why they have weak incentives. You have to understand, why markets work, and their virtues and the nature of the high-powered incentives that are accessible there. You have to understand market failure and what causes it. You have to understand organizational virtues and the beneficial attributes that you can access through internalization. And that to try to pit these theories against one another, I don't really think makes a lot of logical sense, let alone empirical sense. And I think a lot of empirical debates really are about theories that are just opposite sides of the same coin, or they're competing forces rather than really competing theories. I think seldom are they really competing theories in that sense. And again, I've said this already, a robust understanding of what shapes the boundary really requires explanations in all of these quadrants. Let me say a little bit about capabilities as a theory of the firm, because it's often spoken of as a theory of the firm. And I think the standard sort of resource-based prediction would be a firm internally sources activities that are superior in capability to external activities or external alternatives, and they externally source all else. And the problem there is there's sort of an endogeneity problem there. The TCE prediction and other theories of the firm type predictions would be, well, that a firm internally sources activities to generate superior capability and capture the resulting rents. It integrates to avoid holdup and to enable the formation of capability that would lead to holdup. And it's really about integrating to avoid these holdup problems, and that those two are extraordinarily interrelated logically, and teasing them apart is extraordinarily problematic. So think about, a common story you're all familiar with, as Disney starts out, it builds an animation capability that it lacks, right? So it's not as simple as, well, you should integrate what you have as a capability. This is a nascent firm is constantly making boundary decisions about what capabilities it wants to build. Then, of course, the narrative proceeds over time and Disney loses its capability in a relative sense to Pixar. And rather than just sort of sitting back and saying, well, let's outsource, or because we don't possess the capability, they make a decision to integrate a capability that they lack. So it twice integrates to build or to obtain a capability it lacks. It's not as simple as just sort of saying we should see firms integrate what they possess as capability, right? So to state it differently, the RBV correctly predicts that there should be a correlation between sort of VRIO resources and internalization, but theories of the firm seeks to articulate what the cause of that is. VRIO resources are composed internally, or they're acquired to enable or induce their formation, to induce this rareness and this uniqueness that would otherwise be problematic to access in the market, and then to protect those capabilities once they're composed. Trying to access them on the outside creates a massive holdup problem, right? So again, these two theories are extraordinarily interrelated and logically impossible to tease apart. I do think that Williamson, there are other theorists of the firm, but Williamson, I think, did fail to see the strategic nature of his own theory. I think one of his own mistakes was in the 99 piece in SMJ. He makes the statement, how should a firm which has pre-existing strengths and weaknesses organize X? And I think this is just not framed right? The question is, why does a firm organize particular activities to enable and develop capability? And again, he kind of punted on this and sort of says efficiency is the best strategy. And I think the alternative articulation here, and Nick Argyris and I have done some work in this space, is to try to say, look, that firms need to internally compose and own what you might characterize as unique complements. So if you think of strategy as seeing and composing complementary activities and assets, the make-buy decision plays out in that you need to, for the most part, own those assets and activities that are unique complements to this bundle that you envision. And that's sort of a strategic spin on the theory of the firm. Okay, let me speak as well to social challenges to the theory of the firm. So there certainly has been a robust critique of theories of the firm that is sort of focused around trust. Well, there's several, but two that I think are particularly important would be focused around trust and another around identity. And the trust version is, look, this kind of begins with Granovetter, that these clever institutional arrangements that economists in the theory of the firm literature talk about are just functional substitutes for trust that's developed through social relations, and that we see both inside firms all kinds of lack of trust, and in markets we see all kinds of amazing trust, and the boundary is really completely irrelevant because you can get trust inside firms and outside firms and no trust outside and inside, and it's all just about the trust concept directly rather than anything about the institutional decision to make or buy. The other argument is that it's really just about identity, that integration is not about formal organization, but rather firms foster identification inside firms, and that this is what sort of generates consummate performance. And it's really just very much about this concept of identity. The challenge that these social explanations face, and Ezra Zuckerman's pointed this out very nicely in a piece with Freeland. He says that, I characterize this as sort of the sometimes problem. Sometimes firms are able to achieve feats of collective performance and are remarkable and inspiring, but at the same time, hierarchies are just as well known for breeding alienation and distrust as productive identification, trust, and cooperation. Therefore, if it's really going to be a social theory of the firm, and you believe this, which I think is correct, that you can get anything inside and outside, you really have to explain when it is that firms produce social magic of trust and identification, and when they don't, and how does this sort of relate to therefore the boundary of the firm. And this is the question that Claudine Gartenberg and I have taken up in a recent project that I'll try to give you just a quick snapshot of. Our premise is that if we're really going to have a social theory of the firm as opposed to a theory of organization, back to that first slide, we must do more than sort of acknowledge that there's a correlation between firm boundaries and social constructs like identity and cooperation, trust and norms. It really has to explain how these boundaries shape and demarcate some unique society or sub-society, social construct, and then articulate how authority that the boundary somehow enables sometimes generates identity and trust, and sometimes alienation and distrust. And so the sketch of this, the argument in this paper is to sort of say, look, principles aspire to compose these well-governed societies that generate identification and consummate performance, and that they do this, and this is sort of straight out of the sort of moral philosophy, political economy literature, that they do it by shaping purpose and justice. And that the legal boundaries of the firm really empower, this is, lots of people have said this, empower principles to be able to shape purpose and justice. They can shape how work is done inside firms, and therefore sort of be able to influence things like purpose and justice. They can resolve disputes and set compensation in a way that's not possible outside the firm. And they can also grant voice rights to literally speak for this entity that we call the firm, this legal person that is the firm. And therefore, that this legal structure enables a social contract. The citizens of a firm grant legal rights to this principle, but they do it in exchange for an expectation that power that's granted to this authority is going to use that power to support principles of purpose and justice. And therefore, the citizens of the sub-society are interpreting the actions of the manager, of the principal, for its consistency with purpose and justice. And therefore, the decisions that they make have this social amplifying effect. If they do it well, we get consummate performance. If they don't behave well, if they don't exercise those rights in ways that support justice and purpose, we get alienation as a consequence. So it's, again, this sort of restates that the point: if you do it well, you get consummate performance, and if you don't, the citizens rise up in rebellion, and you get worse than perfunctory results. This is kind of the Spider-Man principle of a theory of the firm. With great power comes this great responsibility. You can either screw it up royally, and you get much wider variance, therefore inside firms than outside firms. And sort of visually, therefore, decisions that you make inside firms about boundary decisions and incentive decisions and job design, alliances and hiring decisions are all have an amplified influence on employees and a much more muted influence on contractors, because they're being scrutinized differently given the nature of the social contract that exists between employees and the firm. Okay. Final thoughts. Future work, I think, needs to highlight the strategic nature of the theory of the firm and really recognize, I think Williamson in part took us down the wrong path by kind of punting on the strategic nature of his theory itself and others. Theories of the firm illuminate how to build advantage and heterogeneity. I think it's absolutely core to how we think about where heterogeneity comes from. It comes from make-buy decisions that enable its formation and protection. Efforts to empirically compare theories of the firm, I think, are highly problematic and need to be thought through carefully. RBV as a theory of the firm is not logically distinct from TCE. It's arguably the same theory, really, RBV as it relates to boundaries, not other things. And then finally, social theories of the firm need to highlight this role of boundaries. If it's really going to be a theory of the firm, it has to embrace and deal with this question of boundaries. Okay, thank you.
So should I just jump right in? Okay, I will. Let me share my screen. With luck, you can now see my screen. And so please, I can no longer see anybody, so please yell if something goes wrong. Let's see. Great. So thank you. Great to be here. Really enjoying it. Really enjoyed listening to Todd. Some of what I say is going to connect I think, in a very complementary way with what Todd says. One of the things is the idea that it can be challenging to compare theories empirically. And in fact, I'm also not a fan of horse races of that type. That said, I think for us to push theory forward, it's important to take it to the data. And what I'll be talking about is that aspect of things. So here we go. This is the plot so far. This is the 4th session. We've had, and I found great photos of people from the web. Connie came, ready for battle. And David in his party outfit there. Bob, Belen, Fanish, and Todd. Todd might have been doing a hypnotist thing there. I'm not sure. What I didn't know what Todd was going to be saying, so this isn't entirely accurate for Todd. But pretty much when I watched the others, and I loved them all, they were largely, in my eyes, applying theory, a particular theory or theories of the firm to understand phenomena. I'm here today, yes, and I should mention as an aside that the Toronto barbershops were closed for a while during COVID. I'm here trying to do something different, and so I'm going to spend my time talking about using phenomena to refine theory, although it can be challenging and problematic. So that's what I've got for you over the next few minutes. First, I'm going to talk about why do this, why use phenomena to try to extend and refine theory or build new theory. And then how to do it, I'm going to give 3 sets of examples related to what I think of as corporate strategy issues around firm boundaries, around the internal organization of the corporation, and then around what I'm going to call other stuff. And in each case, I'm mostly going to highlight a few papers that I've been thinking about that I've seen recently that I like, and the way that they are trying to push some of these theories forward by confronting them with data. So that's where we're going. So why do it? Well, this is part of normal science. You develop theory. You, as difficult as it may be to test, you do want to ultimately confront it with data to get a sense as to whether it makes sense or not. And very importantly, what the boundary conditions are and what else we need to bring in. So this is just a bit of what we do. Now, if theory always lined up with the real world, we wouldn't have to do this, but there's the famous line, in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, they're different. Now, that's variously attributed to Albert Einstein, Mark Twain. I heard it from Steve Tadelis, so I'm willing to believe that actually Steve's the one that came up with it. Anyway, so thinking about normal science, and this is one brief way of thinking about different types or flavors of research that was developed by our dearly missed colleague at the Rotman School, Will Mitchell. And the colors don't matter, but the basic idea is much of normal science involves addressing a gap in existing theory. So we find new empirical data, and we use it to try to help test theory and extend our arguments beyond where they currently are. And a piece that I think of as being related to corporate strategy is this working paper, I think it's still a working paper that Frank Nagel and others have now that start with transaction cost ideas. And the basic idea is those ideas seem to make sense for a lot of things we've seen, in the last millennium. But now we've got these digital ecosystems. To what extent, how does one extend them? Do they still explain things in this world? And so that's largely a research agenda paper. It's not specifically doing a full-blown empirical study, but it lays out markers for the kinds of empirical work you can do to use the digital ecosystems to help refine the existing theory. So the ideal paper at the end is, well, this theory helps us understand this phenomenon, and this phenomenon helps us further understand the theory. So this is the idea, use the phenomena to identify boundary conditions and complementarities among theories. There's another kind of research, what we'll call RED, where you're mostly focusing on trying to explain these important empirical questions and puzzles. So I won't be talking a lot about this, but the basic idea is this is where you take a theory and you apply it to try to understand what's going on. And David Teese has done this in many different iterations related to different aspects of corporate boundaries. But let me run ahead to the green research, which is to take, you're both looking at possibly new empirical questions or puzzles. And as you answer them or try to understand what's driving this, you create new theory or use new theory to explain this phenomenon. And I think of Ezra Zuckerman's work that either launched or relaunched or jump-started categories research as being an example of this. There's this puzzle, a different way of thinking about what we might call the diversification discount, and that's a sociological approach. What would a sociological approach to this look like? Blah, blah, blah. So here, for me, I think of this as we pay attention in our large sample research, statistical work. We're looking at averages in regression analysis frequently. So we often ignore outliers. This is saying, let's pay attention to these outliers, these empirical features or puzzles that don't seem to make sense. Those can be a great way for us to try to extend and refine our theory to really find these boundary conditions. So with that background, I'll turn to how to do, I've already basically said this, use the phenomenon to seek the boundary conditions of theory or to integrate theories. Notice I'm not saying run a horse race, because I agree with Todd, that's not necessarily the most fruitful way to go. But looking at how far one theory goes and what you need to take or what complements from another theory, I think may be useful. And then this identifying surprises in the phenomena. I'll walk through the three sets of examples I talked about. So we spent a lot of time in our field talking about diversification or boundaries of the firm. We already have today. And there are a range of theories. Todd touched on these. I have a list of others here. Not that it matters, but I've sort of grouped them as, traditional organizational economics or related theories from strategy, then a slightly broader view that still often touch on efficiency in some way, but they relate to things outside the firm. And then theories like institutional theory or categories that at the extreme may say, what is this thing called efficiency of which you speak, that are looking for very different motivations. so these theories separately have been used and sometimes in conjunction to try to understand what's going on with a range of diversification and boundaries of the firm issues. I want to highlight a few that deal with this issue of what assets or activities or businesses are jointly owned or should be jointly owned, and think of them in terms of how they help us also understand theory. And I always feel a little funny talking about my own work, but it is the stuff I know best. So I'm going to touch on a few of mine before getting into others. So I'm not yet convinced that I'm willing to continue talking with Todd. I'm not entirely convinced yet that RBV and TCE are the same theory in the sense on boundaries, in the sense that they both have certain predictions. In the piece way back in the last millennium that I did, one of the key things that came out of it is when you bring elements of these two theories together, it looks like the resource firms do indeed diversify in the direction that would enable them to use technological resources they have in-house. But when markets for technology exist, allowing for the kind of transaction cost-driven contracting you might expect to see, that effect is far attenuated. For me, one of the things that comes out of that is sort of boundary conditions of the resource-based view and connections to TCE, and a way of thinking that Joe Mahoney put very nicely. In all candor, I can't remember if he wrote this or if it's just something he said to me, but that one way to think of it is the resource-based view or the knowledge-based view might tells us a lot about what assets go together, chocolate and peanut butter, and TCE is particularly helpful in figuring out how, in the same company or not. So the idea of these two theories is looking at one thing. To give you an example of an empirical puzzle that one might look for, if you go back to the classic studies on make versus buy or things like that in organizational economics that we often use in our work, all of them use trucking as the canonical example of where you should see arm's length contracting with some owner operators. So with Holmstrom and Milgram, Alchian and Demsetz, Klein, Crawford, and Alchian, Williamson all have different approaches to what should lead you to bring things in-house, but they all have the exact same thing. Well, a trucker is an arm's length thing. But there's a real empirical puzzle, which I knew about only because before academia, I was in consulting and happened to do some work on transportation and logistics, that a majority of truckers in the US, insert state truckers, are actually employees who drive company trucks. So there's this puzzle. We need to try to extend the theory to help explain that, but then that extends the theory. So that's the idea there. Looking at these other things, I've been really, and this isn't just because Todd's here, but I've been a big admirer of the work that Todd and Jackson did, bringing in these ideas of social comparison to help us understand how firms might work. And Claudine Gartenberg with colleagues, Emily and Julie have been doing some really interesting empirical work that helps us understand social comparison and how it hits up, at least to my reading, against efficiency reasons for expanding the boundaries, divesting, and so on and so forth. And I think this ends up helping inform both theories. I won't walk in great detail through all the others because they're here and I don't want to take a lot, they're listed here and I don't want to take a lot of time, but Evan Rowley with colleagues doing work. We have a lot of stuff on scope economies, but to some degree, a lot of the work had been sort of cross-sectional static. And so Evan's work, looking at refocusing after certain shocks or experiments, helps really flesh out and extend the work on scope economies that we think we know so much about. Arkady Sarkatov with theoretical work, and then Marco, Maria, and Juan with their work trying to test empirically these theoretical predictions, has helped to juxtapose the sort of classic synergies view, scope economies, and resource reallocation in a way that I think not only helps us understand what firms are doing, but helps us have a deeper understanding of the two theories involved. For the future, I'd love to see some work that took this to thinking about legitimacy and efficiency. In cases where legitimacy really, where do we see a strong, and forgive me if this work's been done and I'm just not familiar with it or thinking of it, where you really have a strong iron, are there places where you systematically have a strong iron cage and efficiency doesn't matter at all? Are there places where the selection environment is so welcoming, so you're not really driven out of business, where legitimation matters more than efficiency? It would be useful to help us try to understand these things. So that's example one. Two, internal, so that was boundaries. Coming to internal organization, there's been we have theories about formal governance mechanisms, informal governance mechanisms, the way you want to manage coordination and autonomy within the firm. Many of these come from economics, some from sociology, and I'm sure there are others that I'm missing. as we think about how to organize within firm activities and distribute decision rights, I'll mention just a couple of things here that strike me. I'm going to mention the first and the third and skip the one on asset ownership. There's been a lot of work on centralization versus decentralization of various activities within the corporation, and a lot of that's on R&D. So I've been involved in a little of that. And we have some basic ideas that when you've got more centralized R&D, you tend to see the inventors creating broader innovations with broader impact that draw on broader search, and with decentralized, it tends to be narrower. By the way, that's neither good nor bad. Going back to Todd's idea about having a theory of value, there can be great theories of value that require narrow and deep search. So just because something's broad doesn't mean it's good, but decentralization narrow, centralization broad. The funny part is there are a couple of different theoretical approaches that might explain or predict that. One is about incentives, that if you've got you're reporting to the corporate folks, they care a lot about things that have spillovers within the firm, so you'll tend to see more breadth. Whereas if you report to the decentralized business unit person, the focus is on narrow stuff. So incentives push you one way or another. But you can also imagine that in the corporate-wide R&D, inventors may rub elbows with people who are more further flung in terms of their interests and knowledge, which can, through the social network point of view, lead to broader recombinations. In a recent paper with Nick Argiers and Luis Rios, we take advantage of looking at changes in firms over time that move from decentralized to centralized or centralized to decentralized, to look at what happens. Because on the day after you centralize, the incentives in principle change, but the networks don't change that fast. And we find some evidence in that paper that it takes 3, 4, 5 years for the network. So once a firm centralizes, you see an evolution of the network, and it's pretty steady, but it takes a while. And the changes in innovation pretty clearly walk hand in hand or follow the changes in the network, not just the changes in incentives. As a guy who comes out of the organizational economics approach, am I thrilled with that? Who knows? I would have loved it if it had been, the incentives are all there are to it, but I have to admit people do matter, even though I don't like people. So I think this is useful as a way of trying to tease out different aspects, complementary aspects of incentives, for example, and networks. So we learn something about the theories and their boundary conditions. Looking at networks within firms can also be useful as an aside, like Guller and Nurkar, and then Moreira, Marcus, and Larson have done nice work. Some network literature, to the best of my knowledge, everyone has to be connected somehow. That's how you know who's in the network, and it's just a matter of what the distances are. Because you never know who's in the risk set who could join and hasn't. But when you look within a firm, you actually have a risk set of everyone who could potentially be connected. And so it's feasible to start pushing the boundaries of certain network analysis in this whole network sense, because if you've got isolated clusters, that's fine. They're still within the overall firm. Let me skip over the asset ownership and jump down to contracting with a firm. One of the things that this is a paper I've been thinking about a lot, empirical puzzle. I grew up to believe that you'd see formal contracts outside the firm, and inside the firm you don't need that. And Katie and Kyle and Beverly have this paper that has kept me up at night for a while thinking about it. A lot of these firms seem to have formal contracts within the firm, and for me that's a beautiful thing. And they're thinking about this. What does this mean for the theories we have about why you see contracting where and why you see boundaries where? So the idea of that is an empirical puzzle. I think there's a lot of mileage to be gained out of that. In the future, maybe there are ways to bring in networks and the agency of the people in the networks, which to me sometimes gets a little bit lost. We think about nodes, but not necessarily about the people and the motivations of those nodes. Networks, agency, and resource reallocation. Do you see, I think we tend to think of resource reallocations coming from the top down, but you see folks at the bottom trying to push that way. And again, there may be literature going on I don't know about, but there you go. In the use of time, I'll move on. Other stuff. These are just things, again, that strike me as interesting, that bring together, often help us hopefully move towards boundary conditions of two theories or extend them. There's the work by Libby Weber with a couple of co-authors, Kyle and Nikolai, on cognition and TCE, the basic idea that the way a contract, is my version of how you think of it, the way a contract is framed. We got a 5-year contract, and if both of us agree, it'll go for another 5 years. Or we've got a 10-year contract, but at the 5-year mark, either of us can say, I don't want to go on. Those should be kind of the same, but in fact, they lead to different behavioral results. That's really interesting. And broader idea of trying to bring cognition and TCE together, which I think Todd's also touching on with some of what he's talked about. Fascinating work that can help use these phenomena of the contracts, and in Libby and Nikolai's work, also the boundary of the firm, because they talk about hierarchy there, use that to help us understand what's going on in the theory. The recent work, and I know this has always been going on, but work I've seen on culture and values within a firm, it seems to me there's got to be a fascinating way to tie this back to efficient governance. For me, this actually goes way, way back to a debate in the 1990s between Kogut and Zander and Nikolai Voss, where Kogut and Zander said, well, within the firm, you sort of have, and it gets to Todd's sub-society idea, we sort of think of each other as they didn't use the word tribe or clan, but that sort of thing. And so we cut each other slack in certain ways. Bringing that in, thinking about what really goes on when, as some of these authors have said, you have different sets of values or cultures in the firm. Do you really have this tribe or clan view? And then what does that mean? Cool stuff. I'm going to stop talking in the interest of time. These are things that keep me up at night. I hope they might keep you. That's it. I'm just a fan of the idea. I love it when I see a paper that says, as I've said once before today, we've applied theory X and maybe theory Y to understand phenomenon Z. And at the same time, we've learned something by using phenomenon Z. We can now come back and say more than we could before about theory X and theory Y. That's all I've got for you today. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Todd. Thank you so much, Brian, for sharing your latest thoughts about theories of the firm. It's a plural form, so there are multiple theories here for sure. So let's turn to the questions and answers here, the Q&A part. So Mu Jun has a question here. Mu Jun, would you like to elaborate a little bit your question?
Oh, I was just, thank you. Just broadly for Todd, my question was whether your work with Claudine has any implications for sort of practices within the strategy process that help principals to establish purpose and sort of justice. And I guess like I've spontaneously thought about, this old work by Chan Kim and Renee Marbon about procedural justice, but maybe your perspective is going to be able to generate something more interesting and sort of like distinct from that type of work. Thank you.
Todd, you are muted.
Yep. Sorry. Thank you. So I went over this very fast with one of those last slides. I mean, I think it's a whole menu of things. I mean, essentially all the actions of a leader. I mean, what we're trying to highlight is that, and there may be others, but these, the questions of purpose and justice are particular filters through which someone with authority's decisions are evaluated. And so it could be compensation decisions, it could be resource allocation decisions, it could be some of the examples we use in the paper are, decisions about who you contract with, or, frequently decisions about vertical, expansion, horizontal expansion, what businesses you get into. Employees of Google rise up in rebellion as they decide to do work with the DoD, and employees at Amazon rise up in rebellion when Amazon does work with local, on facial recognition with law enforcement. That the citizens of these firms have preferences as it relates to purpose and justice, and those actions get filtered through those. So I think it's a bunch of things. It's not any set list per se.
Thank you. So we have another question from Adrian. And Adrian actually has two questions here. So Adrian, if you are still here, could you elaborate your question a little bit?
Right. Yes, good evening. Is evening here in the UK. Two things which I was stimulated by listening to Todd, which I found very revealing. you were talking about the social theory of the firm, and you touched upon the fact that there is trust and that there are relationships. Some theories suggest that there are trust relationships established across organizational or firm boundaries. And so in the eyes of these people, the firm does not explain anything. Now, it seems to me that the extra thing we have to explain here, if we assume, take it that trust exists through clans, and Brian was talking about clans a little bit towards the end of his presentation, and that all organizations, whether they are firms or not, are a form of clan. So that explains at least part of the trust issue. We then have to ask what extra is explained by crossing the boundary between organization and firm. In other words, the form of economic or legal entity that firms are, that other organizations are not. And I'll leave that for a moment, and if I have time now, I'll ask the second question.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a great question, and as we've talked about this paper with Bob Gibbons, he's pushed us on a similar question. So we have particularly focused on the boundary of the firm as a device that enables authority, right? But it doesn't matter what the source of that authority is, that everything else holds as long as there's some kind of authority. And what we think of authority doing is creating this amplification effect, right? So that decisions that are made by an authority have an amplifying effect on social outcomes, for better or worse, right? Either it can reinforce purpose and justice, or it can undermine them. So the magic that happens at the boundary is that it creates authority, and in creating authority, you create this amplification of decisions made by a leader. And if there's no authority,
I'll interrupt briefly. So what happens then in situations, for example, in some of the clusters in Italy, where you have very strong institutional boundaries, authority mechanisms, which to some extent transcend those organizational boundaries, and maybe so that the authority comes from outside the firm rather than within it.
So, I think at some general level, it's a theory about the influence that authority has. So I suppose it would transcend organizational boundaries then, its impact, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
But because I'm also doing some research with a colleague in Vietnam, where of course there's a very strong institutional structure which transcends all organizational boundaries, and which all organizational authorities somehow subject.
Another way to articulate is that the puzzle is that the social theorists have sort of pointed out, look, you got these fuzzy outcomes that are overlapping, that firms create this and markets create that, but these things are massively overlapping. And they tend to just sort of punt and say, oh, well, then the boundary, these institutional mechanisms don't really matter. The boundary doesn't matter. And this is trying to say, well, no, actually, the boundary dramatically shapes the outcomes you get in a different way inside firms than outside firms, or inside a place where authority exists than in a place where authority does not exist, would be another way to say it more broadly.
Can I ask my second question, Tony, or are we out of time?
We do have time. Yeah, thanks.
I have time. Okay. My second question was, when I looked at what you were proposing towards the end, I got the impression that you were trying to actually make a distinction between badly run firms and well-run firms. it was almost as if you were sort of positing a theory of performance rather than a theory of the firm at some level. You were saying basically that if people exploit people, then they will eventually go out of business. There will be an uprising amongst employees, and the structures will cease to work. Pardon me if I've actually misinterpreted that, but that's what came across.
Go ahead.
Okay.
That isn't the intent of the theory, but it certainly is an implication, I would say. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, the point is, a theory of the firm surely has to explain badly run firms as well as well-run firms. That's what I was working up to. Well,
and so that is part of what we think we're able to do here, right? Is that we're saying that badly run. We're both explaining something about the boundary, and we're explaining badly and well-run firms. Well-run, well-governed societies or well-governed sub-societies are those that where the leaders are behaving in ways that are consistent with purpose and justice, and the citizens of that sub-society, identify therefore with the firm, and consummate performance is generated, right? So that's the narrative. Another question you could ask is, well, what about a firm that doesn't have much of a purpose? And that's a different discussion. But yeah, it certainly has performance implications. Yeah.
Thank you. I thought Brian has something.
I wanted to follow up because related to Adrian's question, I guess the first question, I was curious, as you were talking, it struck me, so there's this literature, now the firm is like a political system in a way. That was sort of what I was getting from thinking a little bit about what you're saying. And there's some interesting work in politics about strategic delegation. So I don't want to people will be unhappy when I make this decision if I can say, oh, well, it had to be done. It's this other person that did it. I didn't do it. I wonder if Adrian's idea about being able, it is twisting his idea, but CEOs may find it convenient to be able to point to institutional pressures outside if they're in a cluster. These institutional pressures are why we have to do these things that make you unhappy. Maybe, do you see, let me say it differently. Is there a role for strategic delegation in the way you're thinking about the sub-society?
So I suppose we're really thinking about the preferences of people inside the organization as opposed to external societal pressures. Obviously, there's going to be some interaction there, but no, we're not. It's not really about external forces. If that's answering your question, I don't know.
So next, we have a comment by Carlos and Christina about what do we really mean by firm here? Are we really talking about corporation, from a sort of a legal perspective, or do we talk about something else? Carlos.
Yes, it just seems to me that, firms are, economics definition, productive units. Corporation has properties that evolved over time to the point that virtually close to 100% of certain kinds of productive units have elected to become legal corporations, and corporate law has been transferred with adjustment, but to many economies. So there seems to be, especially when you talk about authority and boundaries, I'm not sure that a firm needs to have boundaries, whereas a corporation definitely has boundaries by virtue of its status as a corporation. And it has unified governance by virtue of its status as a corporation. The head of the corporation, the governor, can decide whether or not to use direct authority inside the firm. If he or she does choose to do so, then the law will uphold that exercise of authority. In any event, I find the concepts overlapping. Are they coextensive? seems to me many of the theories of the firm really need the properties of corporations to hold. Christina, help me out.
Christine, you want anything else? Or
I think I was moving in a slightly different direction that shares the quality of wondering if we're getting ourselves in trouble by calling different things firm boundaries. So I'm working on a paper right now on the performance implications of IT outsourcing. And I'm having lots of fights with myself and with the referees on what's the level of analysis that we should use? Where does the theory lie? Where does the data lie? Can you please bring them together? And this concept of, going back to make versus buy, being at like the transaction level. But some of the things we've been talking about here as firms are not about transactions or how you aggregate up a mix of make and buy into this thing called the firm whose performance we have to assess. And so there's these, we keep using the same term basically to mean conceptually and empirically distinct constructs.
Agreed.
I'm not sure I totally follow, because I mean, we're still talking about, even when we're talking about, you got 35 activities and you decide which ones are inside and outside, that's then defining the firm boundary. Now, I don't know if you're talking about hierarchically, you can have a nesting structure of a subsidiary or a division that's under a larger corporation. Are you talking about that? I'm not sure I see the fuzziness in how we're talking about the firm.
Well, if you go to collect data and you go to an entity and try to collect their data and it gets associated with a firm, that's sort of a empirical definition of a firm or a workplace or an organization, and doesn't always map onto this notion that you would aggregate up. Okay.
So you talk about that, the hierarchical structure.
And this idea of employees, are we thinking about, make versus buy at the employee tells you whether they're part of the firm? That seems related to Carlos's point about what does that boundary entail in terms of a mechanism or a choice or a trade-off, as opposed to just a descriptive fact.
The thing we call the boundary is in fact the product of a lot of legal evolution that found it useful, where managers found it useful and legal scholars found it reasonable to say there can be this thing that owns stuff, and that ownership boundary is not the same as the people who own the firm. The firm is the corporation is distinct from its owners, so even just talking about the boundary, until you have a legal setting that says there is a boundary, and an institution that's different from the.
I think the way we think about it is that there's something different between employment and non-employment, and
even employment is a long-standing. That evolved over time in tandem with the idea of asset ownership. That was Zuckerman and Friedland, fabulous people. So again, it became a nexus around which people started endowing this thing with properties, which we now theorize about.
Is that, but I don't see, so don't you think the evolution of this thing has changed the evolution of behavior? That's the question. If it's just been reactive, then it doesn't matter.
If it didn't change behavior, they wouldn't have gone for it.
Right. So I think that we recognize that there's some magical thing. I think there's some magical thing that happens at the boundary. The question is, what is it? What is the magical thing that happens at the boundary? And the theory here is that it isn't, it's clearly authority. There's something authoritative that happens because of an employment relationship. And then the question is, well, what about identity? What about trust? How does that magical thing that happens at the boundary as it relates to the legal distinction of authority, how does that then magically affect these other social things? And that's what we're trying to sort of
that's a narrower definition of the theory of the firm than I thought.
I'm sorry to interrupt the discussion so far, but I think Brian has something real important to add before we close the session today.
No, I don't think so. But I'm happy to use the identity issue. Is a really, to me, a quite interesting one, because it's a matter of it goes a bit back to that Kogut and Zander thing that I referenced. Like, if I'm an employee, I do the exact same thing, and somehow if I'm an employee, which maybe this legally externally generated concept, but I'm part of the team. I feel like I'm part of a team. And if I'm a contract worker doing the exact same thing, I don't feel part of the team in the same way. And that affects the way I feel loyalty or wounded as things happen in a way that one might not just expect from a bloodless theory.
So what about unions, though? What about the classic opposition of the lowest level employees and the managers and the high levels of disaffection?
But that's the point. Depending on how it's played out, that boundary effect can have a massively negative impact. It's an equally negative impact as it has a positive impact, but it has a different impact than it does for non-employees. That's the argument. But you clearly important, massively.
Yeah, thank you all for
a great session.
For a very active discussion and debate. And one thing I realized about the discussion about theory at the firm is that it's always raising, sort of more questions than answers. And that's why it's such a, question or a topic of sustaining importance to the field. Thank you so much for everyone for coming to the session today. And I'm hoping that the discussion today will bring some of the topics, for discussion offline between folks after today's session. And thank you so much. Really appreciate your involvement and participation.